I'm Marilyn Childers. I'm the Executive Director of Facts Analysis and Research, and I just want to welcome you to the seminar. I don't have any official role today except to say welcome and to introduce our esteemed Chair, Kate Alexander. And my team have given me some lovely things to say about her, so you know who you're dealing with. Kate's the Executive Director Office of the Senior Practitioner for the New South Wales Department of Family and Community Services. I knew that bit. The OSP was established 3 years ago to inspire, influence and review child protection practice. Kate is responsible for the OSP's work in the review of child deaths, leading evidence-based child protection approaches and facilitating learning through conferences, publications and coaching strategies. Kate has a Masters of Social Work and Family Therapy and has worked in the fields of child protection and sexual assault services for more than 25 years in a variety of roles, including therapeutic, casework and management. She's just been accepted to undertake a PhD at the University of Melbourne, focused on decision making in child protection. In 2010, Kate was awarded a Churchill Fellowship and travelled to the United Kingdom, Norway and America researching child protection systems with a focus on the skill set of the frontline workforce. Kate's research led to the development of the New South Wales Practice First framework and the New South Wales Practice Standards. Kate can leap buildings in a single bound. No, look, and they're all the really great things that make up Kate, but Kate also has had a significant influence on us, on the people in family and community services. So since she came, she really brought the front line into our working lives. And while we had tried really hard to engage with the front line, what Kate did was she really set up initiatives that took us, the people who were working a little bit removed, down into the frontline offices and really gave us the opportunity to experience what was going on. Before we got that opportunity, I'd sit in meetings, and when it came to talking really about practice and frontline, you know, I'm an analyst and a researcher and a statistician. I thought I had nothing to say, so I'd sit back and leave it to others. But from my experience just going into the frontline offices and really engaging in the work that they're doing, it made me appreciate and understand it and actually think about it. And so since then I've really changed in the way I work, the way I think about it and the way I think about the people that we actually work for. So that's really the biggest influence for me, and so we're really lucky to have her chairing for us today. So thank you for chairing, and on with the show.
So good morning everyone. As you heard, my name's Kate Alexander and I'm the Senior Practitioner. I'm dropping the Executive Director title from my name with the permission of our boss, because we decided that we like Senior Practitioner as a stronger title, which is really about practice, more about practice and families and children and less about a bureaucratic label. So that's my new title. I would like to extend a warm welcome to all our invited presenters, panel members, staff from Family and Community Services and the non-government sector, our Aboriginal colleagues and guests joining us today. I'd like to acknowledge the Wongal people, who are the traditional custodians of this land, and pay my respect to elders both past and present. In a few moments I'll be inviting Uncle Alan Madden to perform the Welcome to Country. You cannot work for this department or indeed child protection anywhere in this country and not be deeply affected by the history of our stolen generation. Yet our Aboriginal families and our colleagues bring such resilience and such hope and humour to this work and have taught us so much. So on behalf of the OSP, I really want to extend my gratitude to our Aboriginal colleagues who are here today and across this department for all they have taught us and continue to teach us about practice and working with families. I would also especially like to welcome Fiona Skelton for travelling from Canberra to be with us today. Finally, I acknowledge all of those who have participated in fact-supported research, especially those who are part of the 3 projects presented today, whether directly or via the use of their data, as without them there is, of course, no research to support policy and practice. I will now hand over to Uncle Alan Madden of the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council to do the Welcome to Country. Thank you, Uncle Alan.
Thank you. Once again, my name is Alan Madden, Gadigal Older. For my first song, I'm only joking, you guys. Married man, 10 children, 26 grandchildren and 3 great-grandchildren. Yes, we did have TV. Just couldn't afford the bloody electricity. First and foremost, I'd like to acknowledge our Aboriginal elders, all elders, past and present, and pay my respects to all our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander brothers and sisters, from whatever Aboriginal or island nation you may have come from. Welcome to Wongal. And to all our non-Indigenous brothers and sisters here today, a very warm and sincere welcome to you. No matter where you've come from, whether it be across the seas, across the state or across town, once again a very warm and sincere welcome to you. As I've mentioned many times before, was, is and always will be Aboriginal land. Only 3 things shorter than that: coming, taxation and going. It is an honour and pleasure to be here today to welcome one and all to Wongal. Wongal is one of 29 clans of the Eora Nation. The Eora Nation is bounded by nature's own. The Hawkesbury River to the north. The mobs up that way call it the Darkinjung. The Pean to the west, the Derribin, and Georges River to the south, Kaimai. And in between those 3 mighty rivers is the Eora Nation. And in that nation there are 29 clans. And the clan's land we're on today is Wongal. On behalf of members of the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council and of the Wongal mob, once again a very warm and sincere welcome to you. There's an old saying out there, and I think it's very appropriate for you mob here today. You fellas heard it 1,000 times before. They say where there's a will, there's relatives. So once again, on behalf of Land Council and of the Wongal mob, welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Uncle Alan. Just a couple of quick housekeeping things, and I'll keep these quick. Just the first one about the phones, your phones. Can you please switch them to silent, just so we don't have any interruptions? We've been reading stuff in the OSP about multitasking and whether multitasking is good in child protection. And there's very strong evidence that multitasking is not good at all. So that's just a little point about phones and giving you full concentration to such important subjects. Today's session will be filmed up here. Don't worry back in your seats, but we will be filming it. It will be edited, and it's important to know that because we will load it up on the FACTS website later so you can access it. If you didn't get a chance to register as you came in the door, please make sure you do so. It's important because we will then email you and let you know when we've uploaded the information. Toilets are just outside there to the right, and you'll notice that when you sat down, you had an evaluation form. When you get a chance, if you wouldn't mind filling them out, they're just really important for us so that we can hold further events and make sure we do them as well as possible. Okay, so to a bit more of an interesting subject, the FACTS External Research Program. Just to give you a quick overview, as some of you will know, Family and Community Services has an external research program. It was established 17 years ago that currently supports more than 20 projects with additional ones in the planning stage. Under the leadership of Marilyn Chilvers and her very, very capable team, the research program provides support to projects ranging from direct financial contribution to the provision of small or indeed very large data sets to assistance to recruit staff or clients to participate in studies by way of focus groups or surveys. These studies may be PhD projects where the assistance provided is in kind only, or they may be large multi-year Australian Research Council funded ones with significant funding from FACTS and involve multiple university, government and non-government partners. These studies provide not only a great source of New South Wales-centric data, but they also contribute to building research capacity and a greater understanding of the important work of the department. And of course, the data gained from research is vital to improving the outcomes of those residents of New South Wales for whom FACTS is tasked with helping, some of whom are among the most vulnerable people in our communities. The order of proceedings this morning, I mean, you've got a bit of an agenda, but just to bring you up to date, you'll be hearing from 3 fantastic researchers about a study they conducted or are currently working on. This will be followed by morning tea and then morning tea for about 20 minutes, that says. And after morning tea, we will move to a panel discussion where you'll get a chance to ask. So as you listen to the presenters, you can hang on to your questions because they will then be up for a panel. With 20 minutes, it's probably best we just let them give the presentation, and there'll be a couple of other people joining them on the panel after that. Okay, so I'm now going to introduce our first of 3 speakers. Dr. Kathleen Falster, and the other 2 are Fiona Skelton and Dr. Paul Gray. As I mentioned, each will present for 20 minutes, and we talked about the questions. The other option is that you might be able to have a chat to some of the researchers in the morning tea break. So in introducing Dr. Kathleen Falster, you'll hear that she's quite an overachiever. Her research, the Seeding Success Study, is one of those currently supported by the FACTS External Research Program. Kathleen is an NHMRC Early Career Fellow with the National Centre for Epidemiology and Population Health at the Australian National University and the Sachs Institute, and she's a visiting fellow at the Centre of Big Data Research in Health, University of New South Wales. Dr. Falster is an epidemiologist with expertise in epidemiological research methods, I'm doing well with these pronunciations, and data linkage and the analysis of large population data sets and cohort study data. Dr. Falster is committed to using epidemiological research to drive improvements in the health of disadvantaged populations, including Aboriginal children. In recent years, Kathleen has grown a program of research focused on child health and wellbeing, including use of linked cross-sectorial population data to evaluate and monitor the impact of real-world programs and services. Kathleen, over to you to take us through the Seeding Success Study.
Thanks, Kate. That was a very warm welcome. Thanks for inviting me here today. I'd just like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land, the Wongal people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. Where is the clicker? Oh, really? Okay. Is there something I can have? Okay, there's going to be lots of little animations. All right, so I'm going to start by briefly telling you about some background to the Seeding Success Study and the types of questions that we're able to answer using these data. Then I'll tell you about the statewide cross-sectoral data resource that we've built as part of the study and show you some examples of findings of our research to date. And finally, I'll finish with some thoughts about implications for policy and practice in New South Wales. Now, the work that I present to you today is the product of researchers collaborating with government agencies to generate evidence for policy and practice in New South Wales. It's involved a large team of collaborators, including researchers nationally and internationally, and policy colleagues in New South Wales, including FACTS, New South Wales Health and Department of Education, but also increasingly interest from Commonwealth agencies as well. And importantly, community engagement throughout the entire process of the research. Our primary mechanism for community engagement with a statewide population level study like this is to have a study reference group, and we worked with the Aboriginal Health and Medical Research Council to identify appropriate members, including themselves, to oversee the directions of the research, the interpretations, findings, and then importantly the dissemination of results. So just now, moving on to a little bit of history of the study. In 2013, our research team was awarded funding from the National Health and Medical Research Council to establish the Seeding Success Study. And this study set out to identify factors that promote positive health, development and wellbeing in Aboriginal children in New South Wales. Now, the research that we've been pursuing the last few years has been focused on Aboriginal children and early life inequalities, but importantly, through this process, we have built a statewide cross-sectoral data resource that involves all children who started school in 2 years in New South Wales, 2009 and 12, and has information on multiple dimensions of disadvantage. And as such, there's a really wide range of questions that we now have the potential to answer with this incredibly invaluable resource. Now, the initial study and its funding are in its final year right now, but we have this resource and we are currently in conversation with various agencies about using it in an ongoing fashion to answer questions like what early life characteristics promote positive early childhood development and health and well-being, and on the flip side, negative outcomes as well. How do child outcomes vary across geographic areas? How can we better predict children that are at risk of various adverse outcomes? And how could this better inform targeted early intervention? What sort of pathways do children and families follow through systems, health, community services, education? And can we use these sort of joined up data to evaluate what programs work and importantly also what doesn't? Okay, so a little bit about the resource itself. For the NH and MRC funded Seeding Success study, the primary outcome that we proposed for that work was child development at age 5. And this was measured from the Australian Early Development Census, which some of you might be familiar with. It measures 5 domains of child wellbeing: physical health and wellbeing, social competence, emotional maturity, language and cognitive skills, and communication skills and general knowledge. And this census was started in 2009 and has been conducted every 3 years since. So the population that's included in the data resource at present includes all those children who started school in 2009 and 12, linked back to their perinatal and birth registration records in New South Wales. And then this has allowed us to follow a virtually complete population of children from birth to school age, and in total that's over 166,000 children. We've also linked to data from other government agencies during the early childhood period, and I'll show you a bit more about that in a moment. We've also linked some parent data in, so some health data from prior to the children's birth, and at school age we've linked in information from their school enrolment records about parent education and occupation status, which is really important because it gives us some family level socioeconomic information that isn't available in most population level data sets. So what's currently in the resource? We now have 10 linked data sources and permission to link to more. And the opportunities to link to many more in the future. But essentially we've got this 2009 school starter cohort and 2012 school starter cohort, and down the bottom it shows the period of data that this covers from 2000 through to 2013. Basically the children records start at the blue boxes, which is the birth records, birth registrations and the perinatal. Then we get things like hospitalisations, emergency department visits, community health services contacts, mental health, ambulatory care contacts, and then they hit school, and that's where we get the AEDC and the school enrolment data. And then in the orange and pink boxes at the top is some of the data on the parents prior to the child's birth. Now, of relevance to this seminar, I wanted to mention how we identified children as Aboriginal or not in the data resource. So as many of you probably are aware, Aboriginal people are often under-enumerated in population data sources for a range of reasons. And enumeration can be improved through linkage of multiple data sources. To optimise identification of Aboriginal children in this study, we have used an algorithm that takes information from any of the 3 records pertaining to the child's birth, as well as their school age record, because all children have these data available. And this table just shows what information relates to the child's Aboriginal status, so their birth record in the hospital and their school record. The mother, it's all about their birth records, and the other parent, which is mostly fathers, is taken from the birth registration. So when we apply the algorithm that gives us optimal identification, we get almost 10,500 Aboriginal children in these 2 school starter cohorts, and that's about 6% of the kids. If you only use a single data source or a couple of data sources, you get 5% and under in each one. It depends very much on the data source that you use. So this is quite a big number of kids to follow. Okay, so I'm going to just show you an example of some work that I think really nicely illustrates the power of big data to highlight in great detail the relationships between early life factors of children and families and their outcomes. The question that we set out to answer in this was, how does a mother's age at childbirth relate to the child's development outcomes at age 5, and was this similar in Aboriginal children and non-Aboriginal children? So as a little bit of background to the relevance of this question, we know that in Australia from perinatal data that Indigenous children are more likely to be born to young mums. There's 1 in 5 born to teen mums than non-Aboriginal children. And we also know from several large-scale data studies internationally that there's this very well-established U-shaped association between a mother's age at childbirth and the child's perinatal outcomes. So things like preterm birth, small for gestational age. And what that means is that the highest risk is in the youngest mums and also in the older mums. There's also some evidence that a child's outcomes are later in their childhood and later life are associated with a mother's age as well. And in the context of most developed countries, there's been a great shift in women's childbearing age. On average, women are having babies much later. Now, mother's age is a really appealing marker of which kids might be funneled into intervention programs or not, because it's a really easily measured thing. Mother's age is available in the clinical setting, it's available on administrative data, and there's quite a lot of programs around for teen mums internationally. There's a lot written on this. So what we wanted to do was explore in detail, in a way that has not been, able to be done without joining up population level data, to really illustrate what this relationship looks like by every year of age, instead of the broad groupings that have been mostly looked at to date. So what I'm going to show you first is the distribution of births by the mother's age at childbirth for non-Aboriginal kids, and on average these kids are born to mums who are about 30 years of age. Then layered on top is the Aboriginal children's birth distribution. So you can see they're born to younger mums. The average age is 25 years, and 1 in 5, like the national data, are born to mothers less than 20 years of age. Layered on top of this is the child development outcomes at age 5. And what we've shown here is whether this is non-Aboriginal kids, whether a child is vulnerable on one or more of those 5 domains that I showed you at the beginning. So we see that the very highest risk is seen in the younger children, and this steadily decreases with every single year of age. It's not just a matter of very young mums versus older mums. It's a really strong decreasing pattern with every year of age. And we've got almost 40% of kids born to mums who are 15 years and younger are going to be developmentally vulnerable on at least one domain at age 5. The lowest risk is seen in the range where the most kids are born, so 30 to 35 years. And then there's this sort of general increase after 35 years. It's just worth noting that the numbers of births in that age range are smaller, so the confidence intervals around the estimates are wider. But the numbers here in this study are the largest so far that have been published internationally on this sort of outcome. Layered on top now is the results for the Aboriginal children. So we see that the highest risk in the young mums is actually really similar whether you're Aboriginal child or not. And while there is a decrease with mothers increasing age in the risk of vulnerability, there is basically this higher risk across the entire maternal age range. So what does this tell us? Is a mother's age at childbirth a useful marker of whether a child might have developmental vulnerability at age 5 and therefore may be in need of intervention? For Aboriginal children, it's not discriminating very well who is and isn't at risk. While there is a higher risk in children born to young mums, there is this very high risk across the entire age range. And yes, there are more babies born to young mums, but it's still really the risk is elevated across the board. For non-Aboriginal children, mother's age does discriminate much better who's at risk and who isn't, but there's so few children born to young mothers that if you were to target a program at teen mums, you're not going to get very many of those overall kids who are at risk. And it's just worth noting, I won't show you the results today, but when we've gone on to do various statistical modelling, socioeconomic position is a really important factor. Once you adjust for that, it basically explains most of the increased risk in the young mums, and it also explains most of the gap between the Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal children, and that gap is biggest among the older mothers. So what are the implications of this sort of work for policy and practice? Well, in terms of Aboriginal children, early intervention services and support really need to target Aboriginal children across the board, not just children born to young mums, as some programs do now. So regardless of the mother's age, and that this is important if we're going to really reduce the gap in development outcomes. Okay, thank you for those slides. Now I'll move on to some work that's new for us in the last year or so. In collaboration with FACTS, we've been growing a program of research relating to children who come into the attention of child protection during early childhood. Now, broadly, most of what's been reported to date in terms of quantitative research has often been contacts with systems at single points in time. And what we've done is linked in the data on these contacts to turn things into a longitudinal picture, so a story of children and families' experiences over time. And this sort of data resource really has the potential to start building up the evidence base to look at, you know, who is at risk and where we might better meet the needs of kids in the system. So by linking in the child protection data to the birth and the school age data sets that I mentioned earlier, we see that of the 166,278 kids in the 2 school starter cohorts that we follow, almost 27,000 of these children will ever be reported at risk of significant harm during the time before they start school. And 7,000 of these children will have a substantiated risk of significant harm report, and almost 3,000 will have at least one out-of-home care placement of some sort. So if you were to imagine standing in a room of kindergarten children, on average across the state, almost 3 children in that classroom will have ever been reported to the system, and 1 in every classroom on average would have had a substantiated report, and on average 1 in every 2 classrooms would have had at least one sort of out-of-home care placement. Now, by joining up all these different types of data sources, we start to be able to pull together a range of different characteristics of the children and families at a population level. And these are just a small selection of characteristics, but the point being that they're from about 5 or 6 different data sets. So in the red bars are children that have had at least one ROSH report during their early childhood years, and in the green are children that never had any ROSH or out-of-home care placements. And at the top we can see that there's very disproportionate representation of Aboriginal children. If you've had a ROSH, you're also more likely to have been born to a single mother, a teen mother, a mother who smoked during her pregnancy, a mother who lived in a disadvantaged area, the most disadvantaged according to the CEFA index. You're less likely to have attended preschool in the year before you started school, and you're more likely to have medically diagnosed special needs by the time you start school, and that's taken from the Australian Early Development Census data. Importantly, almost 20% of kids who ever had a ROSH are Aboriginal, and we know from the census data that only 5% of the general population of kids 0 to 5 are Aboriginal. So this is very disproportionate representation. Now, the analyses we're working on at the moment are all quite early stage, and so I'm not in a position to share a lot of data yet on this, other than to say we are in the process of working closely with FACSA and other arms of the policy agency, and also our community reference group, who provide very important real-world interpretation. So we've got members on the reference group who actually part of the Brighter Futures service delivery network. We've also got people from other early childhood maternal and health services as well. And so when we produce these data, we go back to our reference group and we show them what we're seeing, and get them to tell us, do they think this matches up with what they're seeing on the ground. Just one example of a question we are looking at the moment. We're looking at what are the patterns of emergency department presentations and hospitalisations for children who come to the attention of child protection during early childhood versus those who don't. This sort of information is really interesting because it's starting to get at, could we start to identify these children earlier if we joined up routinely collected data and that was available to frontline workers? I'll show you one slide from this at the moment. Now, in the red boxes are results for kids who had at least one ROSH report, and there's the ED visits up the top and the hospitalisations down the bottom. And in between are the results for the general population of kids. In summary, the green sections of the bars are no presentations during early childhood to the ED or hospital, and then as the red gets darker and brighter, it's increasing frequency. So in summary, what we see is that kids who have a ROSH report, they're a bit more likely to present at least once to the ED or the hospital during early childhood. But the really important difference is the frequency of admissions. So kids who have had a ROSH report are touching those systems more frequently. And the reasons they're hitting those systems are actually similar, but again, the frequency is higher. So respiratory conditions, infections and injury are the main reasons for kids presenting, but just much more often. So in terms of, this work is under development, and we are also doing the analysis specifically on Aboriginal children, and I look forward to showing those results at a later date. But I guess the main thing we're really trying to get at in terms of policy and practice is, could joined up routinely collected data at the point of care help workers identify children earlier? So if you were to imagine you're an emergency department triage nurse or the doctor in the setting, and you don't just see the child and family in front of you, you also have some information about the fact that this child presented to 3 other emergency departments in the last year, and 2 of those were for injuries to the head. And, in the year before that, they had a whole lot of untreated respiratory infections. So that sort of information might really start to shift your thinking on whether this child is at risk of harm or not. That's just thinking of health data. If you also brought in other types of data as well, that might really shape your picture a lot more. So just to wrap up, I just wanted to make a couple of comments on the broader program of research and the cross-sectoral data resource that we've built as part of this study, and what I think some of the implications for policy and practice are at a broader level. I think importantly, joined up cross-sectoral data really can make visible the experiences of small and vulnerable population groups. And for Aboriginal children, this is really important. It's, as anyone knows who's worked with smaller cohort studies, recruiting via clinical services or community-controlled organisations, it's a big job. And while those sorts of studies offer very detailed information about the children and families, what this sort of work does is show the magnitude of the problem at scale in a population and really help identify what information could be needed to fill in the gaps that you can collect at a clinical and community level. But really there's just so much to be learned. We're really only scratching the surface at the moment in terms of how we can understand how these kids move through the systems. And in terms of how the research relates to the FACT's strategic objectives, I think the 2 that I thought were most relevant, the children and young people are protected from abuse and neglect objective. I think from this sort of data resource, we can learn a lot about the pathways of children and families into child protection, how they progress through child protection, and meanwhile are also in contact with health systems, education, etc., and how they might come out the other side, and what are their life outcomes further down the track. How do we better identify at-risk kids earlier than we are now? How could we support families earlier to change those outcomes and how they progress through the system? And that sort of information can help target early intervention, as well as support services for those kids that will inevitably be in the system. And in terms of the objective around improving outcomes for Aboriginal people, families and communities, we can learn right now from the data we have on this very large contemporary cohort what the early childhood outcomes of these children are, and this can help inform how we might better meet the needs of these kids in the immediate term and the future cohorts of children. But we can also follow them over time by linking to later outcomes of these children and learn more about how that goes. And then the final one is, I think, the really big blue sky picture is about learning what works and what doesn't work. And this sort of cross-sectoral data resource, we have a few trial projects embedded within it around evaluation of programs and some really interesting learnings emerging from that work. But this sort of data resource, if it's upscaled and follows populations over time, is an incredibly powerful resource for learning and adapting systems so that we can refine our programs, refine our policies and target our reforms to get better outcomes for these kids. Thank you. I'd just like to acknowledge this work. I'm one person here today, but this is a very large collaboration of people. The work is led by our team at the University of New South Wales. It's been funded by a quite large NH&MRC grant for this period. But yeah, it's involved a lot of government agencies, data linkage centres, data custodians. It's a big endeavour. Very happy to talk to you about it more, and if you have interest in using the resource or being involved in any way, let us know.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. It's an amazing amount of information in such a short time span. I'm sure you'll agree with me. I felt really relieved and grateful that today's session is being filmed, because there's just so much in those slides that is relevant to all of our work. Great question. Michael, will copies of the slides be... Yes, there you go. Excellent. Thank you. I would now like to introduce our second speaker, Fiona Skelton. Fiona is the Assistant Director of Footprints in Time, the longitudinal study of Indigenous children, research and methods section at the National Centre for Longitudinal Data, Department of Social Services, Canberra. Fiona has worked on Footprints in Time since its initial funding in 2003, including community consultations, study design, trials in the Torres Strait, quantitative and qualitative pilots and interviewer training. She currently manages the study's content development and analyses the data in the National Centre for Longitudinal Data at the Department of Social Services. Fiona has 3 fabulous children, a Bachelor of Social Science from the University of New England and a Master of Social Research from the Australian National University, another overachiever here. I would like to thank Fiona for travelling to Ashfield from Canberra to be with us for this morning's presentation. Footprints in Time is not part of the FACTS External Research Program, but we have invited Fiona to speak about it today because it provides such valuable data from the general population with which to compare data collected by FACTS. Over to you, Fiona, and thank you.
Hi everyone. I feel like a bit of a fraud because I'm not really a researcher, I'm a public servant. Yeah, so leave it at that. Let's straight on to this one. So I acknowledge the Wangal peoples of the Eora Nation. I come up from Ngambri in Ngunnawal country today, where my kids were born. Well, at least 2 of them. The other one was born in Fiji, which is a different set of Indigenous people. And I grew up in Ku-ring-gai, so it was nice researching, because when I grew up I didn't know anything about the Aboriginal people and the lands that I lived on. So we're starting to learn a lot more, which is really good. I'm going to go really quickly through a whole lot of background and research and all sorts of different bits, and hopefully spark your enthusiasm, and then you'll find out a whole lot more and ask me lots of questions, and it'll all be really good. So if I talk too fast, or just tell me to slow down or something. I get carried away because I'm very excited about what I do. So very, very quickly, I'll just go through what is Footprints in Time, who's involved, where are we, our methods, selected findings, and then how you can apply for the data or use the data or get more information. So we're an Australian government longitudinal cohort study. We have ongoing funding. Anybody who saw the budget stuff last night, we didn't get a mention, but we did get some more money so that we can continue to do not just the longitudinal study of Indigenous children, but the longitudinal study of Australian children, the HILDA study, which is household income labour dynamics, that's the economists one, study, and the Building a New Life in Australia, which is the longitudinal study of humanitarian migrants. So we have enough money to keep going, and we're very lucky we have ongoing funding, which, feel free, Kathleen, having to search for funds all the time is really hard. We started to have a look at how early childhood affects later life outcomes. If you compare Australia with the United Kingdom or even New Zealand, or of course the Scandinavian countries who are always ahead of everything, then they have a rich resource of longitudinal cohort studies to draw on, whereas we really got started in terms of a national approach in about the turn of the century. So LSIC was one of those because they looked at the longitudinal study of Australian children and went, we might be able to look at Indigenous kids' outcomes separately. We need a different study, and we need a study that consults with Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people first, and that's where I got involved. We're guided by a steering committee which is chaired by Professor Mick Dodson. He's been chaired by Professor Mick Dodson since 2003 because we knew he'd be Australian of the Year one day. No, we didn't, but yeah. Managed in DSS, unlike the other studies that we fund, this one we've got internally, and we employ our own Indigenous interviewers, because at the time that we started we couldn't employ a company or an agency like Australian Bureau of Statistics and guarantee that we would have Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander interviewers, and we thought that was a really important thing to do. And so you can see sort of briefly a picture of some of our interviewers down there. Some of them are people who work in our main office as well, but also get out and do interviews. And they even let me do pilot interviews even though I'm not Indigenous. You have to be Indigenous normally, but they say if you're going to design the questions and you do a really bad job of it, you can go and ask them. And then if you stuff it up, then you'll know. And of course that happens, and of course we work on it until you get it better. Okay. The key research questions which we worked on with our steering committee and design group. What do Aboriginal kids and Torres Strait Islander kids need to have the best start in life to grow up strong? What helps them stay strong or get more healthier, more positive, more strong? You're seeing a theme here, aren't you? How are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander kids raised? And what's the importance of family and extended family and community in the early years of life? And how can services and other types of support make a difference to the lives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait kids? What are our methods? Well, we started with community engagement in each site. I even came to Sydney a million years ago. Did anyone? No, there's no one here who was there at that consultation. Good, because all the mistakes I made you won't remember. One of the big feedback things that we got from a lot of the people we consulted with early on was, can we please have a positive focus? We only hear the bad stories all the time. There are some really good things happening with Aboriginal and Torres Strait kids. Tell us about it. So we have a commitment to that. It doesn't mean we don't always get the good stories. We do hear the bad side as well, because that's what government often want to focus on, but we try and focus on the positive. A commitment to feedback. So we do provide feedback to the families and communities, and we try and write reports as well. And we've got publicly available data. So you can apply for it, you can get it, you can have a look at it. And we're getting more and more. I think we've got up to about 300 data users now over the various waves, and more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander researchers, which is fantastic. We have an annual quantitative data collection, so the interviewers go out to families, interview in the home, and collect information about a range of things. So questions will change when it's relevant to their age. Not much point asking kids about school when they're not there, but once they get to school, we ask a lot of questions about it. This year in the field, we're asking kids about their experiences of racism. They're 12 and 13-year-olds. Next year, we're asking them about their developing sense of identity. So there's some really exciting stuff that's coming through. And a lot of those questions were developed with design advisory group from people like Associate Professor Gawain Bodkin-Andrews at UTS, and some really wonderful people who have generously give their time and effort to try and make sure that we do the right thing. And we link data as well. So we've linked to NAPLAN scores and to MySchool data in the latest release. You probably want to use it. Next, thanks. Where did we find the kids? There's no list. that says I'm an Aboriginal person or a Torres Strait Islander person that anyone can go to and go, oh yeah, that's an Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander person. So we use Medicare and Centrelink lists right in the beginning. Australian Government Department, that helps. Just because someone's been identified or is identified on a list does not mean when you knock on the door that you've actually got an Aboriginal person there. But if you've got an Aboriginal person knocking on the door and going, hey, do you want to be a part of this? Then you're much more likely to have that person say, well, yeah, I want to be part of it. And yes, I am Aboriginal. So we tried to make sure we had Indigenous people right from the start. So in the beginning, we had more than 1,670 parents and carers, it's usually mums, of babies and 4-year-olds. That's 2008. And thanks to our fabulous interviewers, we still have more than 1,230 interviews with families each year. When we started, Steve Zubrick, our lovely person who comes from Longitudinal Study of Australian Children, he's the Consortium Advisory Group Chair, and I don't know if anyone's seen Life at 1, Life at 3, Life at 5. He's the one with the American accent. When Trump got in, he said, no, I'm not American, I've been in Australia for a very long time. Anyway, he's the one who said, it won't work. I've just done the WA Aboriginal Child Health Survey. I can tell you, you're not going to be able to get out there and get people back again. You've got a population that's got far too many things to do and are far too stressed to be interested in doing interviews. But I think because we've got Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander interviewers, and because we're talking about kids and what makes a difference for kids in the long term, we've kept people involved because they want a voice to government, and this is one way. Okay. Not all of our parents are Indigenous, of course, because we might be interviewing mum, but it's dad who's the Indigenous parent. So back in wave 1, we had 75% of the parents Aboriginal, 4% Aboriginal Torres Strait, 7% Torres Strait Islander, and 15% who are not Indigenous. All the kids, of course, are Indigenous or have been identified by at least one parent as being Indigenous. 40%, or just over, are in the lowest decile for socio-economic disadvantage. So they tend to live in areas where the people around them have got lower educations, unemployment, lower incomes. That's what the CIFA scale kind of measures. 27% of the parents speak an Indigenous language. I just dropped a few stats in here so you can kind of get a picture of what sample we're talking about. 15% had postnatal depression. This is self-identified, and another 2% said they probably did in hindsight. Now, I did look at what we had in wave 1 for the number of parents who weren't actually the mother of the child that we interviewed. And we did have 34 dads, 47 grannies, 19 aunties, and a bunch of cousins and stuff as well. So mostly mums that we're interviewing at the beginning. Of the kids, we've got more than 80 tribal language groups. Now, we don't release that information because it might identify kids in the study, and we try and keep privacy paramount. But what we can do is something like these footprints that I've put up, which show you on the left, language groups, so people in Torres Strait who speak Kalakawalia. We've got people who are speaking Jambapangu, and a whole bunch of different languages. And then on the right you can see or lots of the different tribes that people come from. And I know we've got at least one Wiradjuri person in the room. We've got lots of Wiradjuri kids because the size of the writing is bigger. So that means there's more, it's the way that little graphic thing works. We've got lots of Yorta Yorta people and Kamilaroi and Aranda people across Australia. And it's a rich and beautiful thing, which is great. Okay. This is a really quick slide. Next one. All right. One of the things we collect is life events, major life events that happen to families each year. And they can be good things like having a baby in the family, a new one, and they can be not so good things like being mugged, robbed or assaulted. And this is just a very quick comparison of how let's have a look at the ones that they collect in the longitudinal study of Australian children and the ones we collect in the longitudinal study of Indigenous children that are close enough. We haven't included humbugging here because it doesn't really match with any of the LSAC items. All right, now let's have a look at the next slide. You all read that really quickly. Don't worry about it, it's not that important. And look at the number of life events that kids in LSAC and LSIC experience. So I haven't got my coloured version here, but LSAC's the yellow So you can see the bars are a lot lower, and the ochre or the orange colour is the LCQs. So they're in families who are experiencing a lot more major life events. That's really all you need to know about this slide, but if you just click again, you can see moved house comes up a bit more often for the LSAC kids, but I think that's because they did it over a 2-year period and ours was 1 year, whereas everything else is 12 months. And if you look at death outside the household, so the family's impacted by somebody else dying, it's huge. And I think it's easy to forget that families are coping with heaps and heaps of stress. Well, maybe you don't, because you're a bit at the coalface, some of you, but for other people I don't think it's as present. Anyway, next slide. This one is trying to show you what happens if you look over a 4-year period. So using that longitudinal data, we've gone back every year, and LSAC, they go back every 2nd year, but I'm only looking at the previous 12 months for each of the data sets. And when the kids are aged, actually this is over the 4 waves, it's not the ages that count, but how many times are their families experiencing more than 3 life events in one wave? And for the LSAC children, more than 70% have never, in 4 waves, had more than 3 major life events that they're dealing with. But when you look at the LSIC kids, 36% have never had that, but 32% have had at least 1. 18% have had at least 2, and so the major life events just keep coming at them. So what does that mean? Let's go to the next slide. Major life events affect things like social emotional difficulties. So difficulties you don't want. This is poorer outcomes for the kids. So you can see the more major life events that you have, the worse your difficulty scores for the kids. And the trajectories are about the same kind of steepness for LSAC kids and for LSIC kids. Now you'll notice that LSAC kids are in the ochre bars or the gold bars. They're higher on the SDQ difficulty scores right from the start. But don't forget, they've had 5 years already of a cumulative higher stress load than the LSAC kids have had. So yeah, just something to think about. This next one, and I should acknowledge a lot of that work was done by Deborah Kakawa, who works in our area. Oh, she's working on building a new life in Australia at the moment, but we borrow her whenever we can. Deborah did some work looking at the LSAC kids and the LSIC kids using traditional measures of disadvantage, unemployment in the household, single parents, that kind of thing. The usual people that we in DSS pick on. And said, okay, well, do the kids who are in jobless households have worse outcomes? Have they got more difficulties? Now you can see the stars for the LSAC kids on the left, and just about all of these things, being in a disadvantaged area, in a jobless household, single parent, the kids have higher difficulty scores. They're not doing so well. But if you look at the LSIC kids, being in a sole parent household doesn't make a difference. Being in an unemployed jobless household doesn't make a difference to your difficulty scores. Financial stress of the household does make a difference. And if your primary carer is in poor health, that makes a difference. So sometimes when we're targeting all these things going, oh, you know, we're really worried about unemployment, we're really worried about sole parents, well, they're not necessarily the things that kids in Aboriginal families we should really be concerned about. Okay, next slide. So now let's focus on the positives. Oh, sorry. Oh, God, I'm going to have to talk really fast. Okay. What helps reduce difficulties? So this slide is showing you some of the things that are related when you do a multivariate model for wave 3, when the kids were 3 and 6 years old. What are the kinds of things that are associated with fewer difficulties? So if the parent has strong relationships. So if they do have good partners and good relationships, then their kids are doing better. If the parent has good mental health is very protective. It helps the kids do well. Fewer major life events, so that's the only one we've got that's increasing the difficulties in here. If the parent's well educated, if they have, as the kids get older, and of course girls are doing better because girls do better when they're that age. If the study child's in good health, and if they're living in an advantage area. So there's lots of different things that contribute to having better difficulty scores, which is good. Okay, next one. This is an extract from a piece that Tom Karma did in the conversation last year, and all it really shows you is if you're experiencing discrimination or racism, then your kids are getting worse difficulty scores. Not really surprising, but you can see it in the data. Next slide. Katie Thurber from ANU has done a lot of work with the data looking at physical health outcomes, obesity and so on. This is one of the things that struck me. What I hadn't realised is that while most people probably know that smoking is associated with reduced birth weight for babies, probably a lot of people don't know that smoking while you're pregnant tends to lead to obesity for the kids later on. So I thought, chuck that one up. And confess that I did smoke with my third child, and you can all hate me for that. There you go. My Rachel confessed this at school. She said, "Oh, my mother smoked while she was pregnant with me," and they went, "I thought she was a nice person." So there, I'm not a nice person. Okay, Katie's latest work has been looking at the trajectories for obesity, and the trajectories for the kids are quite steep in ages 3 to 9. So normal kids with normal BMIs at her baseline, 30% of them later on had in 3 years got into the obesity or overweight category. So that's an issue. Next one, nurse home visits. This is a wonderful thing about longitudinal data. You can look back at nurse home visits later on and go, is it related to anything that might be good for kids? Now, I have to stress this is not causal. So having a nurse home visit does not mean that you've got better scores on strengths and difficulties, or that your pro-social scores are better, or that your literacy scores are better, your vocabulary is higher. But what it does mean is that there's some kind of association. So does it mean that having that visit means that you're better at accessing services when you need them later on? Don't know. There's a whole lot more exploration that you could do, but there is a relationship between nurse home visits and better outcomes later on. Next. What is it about Aboriginal and Torres Strait culture you want to pass on to your kids at this age? What a fascinating question and fascinating answers. All I'll headlight at the moment is that respect, family history and pride are right up there for everybody. We get different results around the country, so bush tucker hunting and that kind of thing is really important in the top end. Not so much in Sydney and Adelaide and Brisbane, our urban areas, but we still get, pride, respect, family history all the way along. Next one. We do have on our website, thank you very much, Michael, you've been great, some of the site feedback sheets we give to families where we just compare, okay, of all the kids who are living in this area, how are you going compared on a few selected things compared to all the kids who are living in the rest of our L6 sites. So this one is showing you Western Sydney, what happens to kids after school compared to everybody else who's in LSIC. Because it's not a representative study, we can't talk about this applies to all Aboriginal kids, it's just all the kids who are in the study itself. So you can see the differences there for some of the things. There's fewer of the kids in Western Sydney who are going straight home after school, and a lot of them going to the shops. Is this an urban thing? All right, next. Just thinking about some of the challenges we've had in terms of getting the study off the ground and keeping it going. The cultural and linguistic diversity within the sample is huge. So I'm trying to design questions that, in consultation with the steering committee and a whole bunch of other people that Gallowinky elders say, well, it doesn't translate, you can't do that, and then people in Brisbane say, well, don't ask me that, you're talking down to me. And you go, well, I've got to try and do it across. And all credit to our interviewers, they explain, we're covering the country, it doesn't always work, and we try and work together to get some alternative wording that does work. But sometimes the questions sound a bit weird, particularly if we have standardised scales like the Strengths and Difficulties questionnaire, the STQ that I was talking about before, which was developed by Robert Goodman in the UK. And Robert Goodman's answer categories are certainly true, somewhat true, and not true, and he won't let you change them. Yes, sometimes no would be much better options. They work in Australia, but no, Robert Goodman says no. Can't be done. So you have to use the scale and you just have to work with it. So what do? We build relationships as much as we possibly can. We employ those Indigenous interviewers. We stress the interview is voluntary. So we say, no, if you don't want to answer any questions, you don't have to. And if you don't want to do it this way, we'll get back to you next year. Ooh, have I run out of time completely? Sorry. We provide don't know and refused options for everyone, for everything. And when we ask people why you stay in the study, and Maggie Walter from University of Tasmania has done some nice analysis about this, a lot of people stress we want a voice back to government that says what's going to make it better for Aboriginal families, and this is one way we can do it. Other people say, look, this is showcasing Aboriginal diversity. Some people say, I want my child's picture in the calendar next year, and if you don't get it done, then I'm not coming back. But also there's the people who say, look, it gives me a chance to reflect for half an hour on this child, because I'm usually running to try and keep up with everything I've got to do, but it's great to have an interview and just focus on that child for an hour. All right, find out more, thank you, find out more about Elsie. Because we're in what's now called the National Centre for Longitudinal Data with those other studies I was talking about, and I did put some information up the back, but you might have missed it. You can go onto the website and you can have a look at LSPIC specifically, but you can also sign up to the source and get our newsletters and things. And I have to absolutely plug the book. Maggie Walter, who you see there, Karen Martin, Terry Dunbar and Gawain Bodkin-Andrews are imminently about to release a book, 13 chapters by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander lead authors about LSIC data from their points of view. So Maggie's written about families, Professor Ian Anderson has written about health and education. There's a whole bunch, and it's coming any minute now. It's so exciting. And you can find out about licenses and data and accessing all the rest of it there. Done.
Thank you, Fiona. I noticed you started with an apology for being a public servant, not a researcher. Well, let me say you couldn't tell, because you're mixing it beautifully on the research front. And as an aside, I'm a big fan of public servants. And they need, our vulnerable people need the brightest and the best of the public to serve them. And you certainly showed that, such authenticity and warmth in your presentation. So thank you. Our last speaker for this morning is, I've got some formal notes about him. I want to be a bit informal because I know Paul. He's a modest fellow. He's a ripper in my language. He really is the real deal. So more formally, I'll tell you that Dr. Paul Gray, his PhD research was supported through our FACS research program. Paul is a Wiradjuri man from New South Wales, raised and living on the land of the Darawal. He is Executive Leader, Strategy, Policy and Engagement for the Aboriginal Child and Family Community Care State Secretariat, ABSEC, which is obviously the peak Aboriginal child and family organisation in New South Wales. While working with FACS as a psychologist, Paul had the opportunity to undertake a research degree examining the impact of abuse and neglect on cognitive processes of emotional regulation and social understanding for young people in out-of-home care. Paul became the first Aboriginal Australian to be awarded a doctorate from the University of Oxford. That's pretty amazing. Thank you. One of my favourite stories about Paul was that when he was at Oxford, he was written up as such an impressive, bright young thing in a serious Australian Journal of Psychology, one of those sorts of serious publications, and the question was where to from Oxford, and Paul said Campbelltown, and because that's where his heart is and that's where the work is, and it's one of the things about Paul I always loved. Paul's current focus is on developing Aboriginal community-led approaches to Aboriginal child and family welfare, empowering Aboriginal communities to design and deliver the supports their children and families need. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Kate. And I'm sorry, just bear with me. I have a ringing in my ear all morning, so I have no feedback through my right ear. So apologies if my volume is all over the shop. Yurdu Marang, Yuandu Paul, Wiradjuri Gabia. Ngadu Banagu Galubara Iora Main Galang. Wangul Bu Main Galang. Ngangu Ngurumbanga Ninangan Giri Duranya Gai Mangangu. So it's just an acknowledgement of the Wongal people of the Eora Nation in my language, Wiradjuri. Apologies for the pronunciation. My family hasn't spoken Wiradjuri for some generations, but we're trying to get it back. And apologies too for not being able to do that properly in Eora as would be proper here. But unfortunately I don't speak Eora either. Before I go on, I do want to acknowledge the groups that supported me in this research. So that includes the Researching Emotional Disorders and Development Lab, formerly of the University of Oxford, now at King's College London, Family and Community Services, ABSEC, and most importantly, the families and young people that invited me into their home and sat with me for more hours than I had a right to expect, and went through these tasks and had a chat, and that was my favourite part of the entire study. Next one. So in some ways this research is a big change of gears from the previous two researchers who have done sort of big population, longitudinal type work. Mine is very small sample, very small study, looking at the individual implications of early adversity on development. And as Kate mentioned, that was really shaped by my experiences as a psychologist with the department, supporting children and young people in out-of-home care, as well as a member of a foster family who had children from, you know, facts coming into our home and seeing how they interact with us and with others and all of those things. I also wanted to say up front, in the interest of time, I've tried to focus on the results and perhaps not so much on the methodology, because we went through a lot of cognitive tasks, and I suppose there just wasn't the time to unpack the theory and the methodology behind each of them. But if you want to grab me in the break and talk about them, feel free. You probably won't get a chance to eat anything though, because I talk a lot. I also wanted to acknowledge up front a number of the limitations in this research. So particularly the noise that comes from the complexity of the children and families that we work with. So there's a lot of confounding variables, which makes it really hard to narrow in on individual processes and link them with outcomes and things like that. We tried, but it is very difficult to do and kind of par for the course for this research. We also, obviously that's exacerbated by the small sample size, and we can always argue about the validity of particular measures. So obviously we need to be cautious about interpreting these results, and replication is always the key. But I suppose to put it in a nutshell, there were two broad aims to this study. One was to try to understand the pathways of risk for emotional and behavioural difficulties for children and young people in out-of-home care. And second, I really wanted to understand resilience. Why was it that some kids seem to be doing quite well? And what can we learn from them to maybe support other children and young people to adapt as well? Next slide. Yay, models. Everyone like models? Good. So this slide depicts our basic theoretical model developed by Lohman and Gunnar, published in 2010. And it outlines developmental risk for emotion and behavioural disorders. In particular, it outlines the important role of caregiving in buffering the developing neurobiological systems, particularly around detecting and responding to threat, and the developing behaviour and emotion regulation systems. So there are three main points that I really wanted to pull out of this model. One is that the scope of developmental outcomes, so that's depicted by these lines here, they narrow with age. This emphasises the importance of the early period in particular, but note that they never reach each other, so there's always opportunity for change. Also at the front end of that, the interaction between environment and genes, and this includes epigenetic processes. And finally, the interaction and interplay between neurobiological systems and cognitive processes and behaviour. So how each of those sort of circles inside those lines feed back to each other. So it's not a simple one-directional thing. Everything is associated with everything else. So based on this model, we sought to identify and explore specific processes of emotion regulation and social understanding that might be affected by maltreatment and contribute to the social and emotional difficulties that are experienced by the children that we work with. On reviewing the literature and existing evidence, such processes, we thought, would likely possess three key characteristics. First, they would develop in the context of parent-child relationships, particularly early in life. Second, they would be functionally linked to the neural networks that are known to be affected by maltreatment. So we're talking about the frontolimbic structures, the amygdala, prefrontal cortex, cingulate, hippocampus. And third, that such variations in those processes should also be linked to emotional and social difficulties in non-maltreated children and adolescents. So if our brain is using the developmental period to calibrate itself to the environment, how might our experiences of violence or neglect impact on those systems? Well, there are a whole range of cognitive processes that might be affected, and so we decided to focus on just a few. How do young people respond to risk and reward and other cues? How do young people attend to emotional stimuli? How do they interpret uncertainty? How do they recognize emotions, understand the perspective of others, and how do we engage socially with our peers? Now, we wanted to take a lot of this research and put it in the adolescent age group, 12 to 17-year-olds. A lot of research is focused on young children, but given how important emotion regulation and social understanding are to our social worlds, and how important the social world is to adolescents, where we're orienting away from our parents a little bit and more into our social space with our peers, how do those processes impact on children and young people in that period of time? And so while many of these studies try to examine maltreated against non-maltreated kids, and we certainly did that for reasons of statistical power, wouldn't we also expect some differences within this group? So that children who are exposed to violence or physical abuse might differ in very significant ways from children whose experiences of neglect or the absence of those serve and return relationships. So if our experience of the world is one of danger, we might become particularly aware of signs of risk or safety. We might do okay with understanding the internal mental states of others, but we might enact more antisocial strategies in dealing with others. On the other hand, if our experience of the world is one of neglect, where our early attempts to engage others have failed, we might have particular difficulties recognizing emotions, or even understanding the perspectives of others or engaging with our peers. We wanted to try to explore these processes in as much detail as we could. So just quickly about our sample. Our sample included 51 children from the out-of-home care system in New South Wales and 28 non-maltreated peers aged 12 to 17. There were no group differences in gender distribution, age or cultural background. And in some ways, we know the overrepresentation of children and young people in out-of-home care, but we were able to have that matched in our non-maltreated sample because of the great engagement of the local Aboriginal community, who were really keen to be part of this research and to understand what was going on for their kids. Exclusion criteria included exposure to sexual abuse. That was purely because the the number of children was really small, and so we decided that would introduce a confounding variable that would just add additional noise. And we also screened the non-maltreated group with a brief interview just to make sure that there were no early experiences there that might be confounding as well. Maltreatment experiences were coded based on an established coding scheme, and that was based on a comprehensive review of file reports. Yes, I acknowledge that there's going to be weaknesses in that, but really there's no good way to gather that information. Whichever way you go about gathering that information is going to have some limitations, and we felt this is probably one of the best ways that we had at our disposal to grab some of that. Consistent with previous research, maltreatment subtypes did co-occur, so approximately 90% of all participants were coded for 2 or more subtypes of maltreatment. Obviously, neglect and emotional maltreatment were the most prominent, and about half of the sample had been exposed to physical abuse. Now, another confound just to note here is the emotional maltreatment includes exposure to domestic violence, and so that kind of made things a little bit messy when we're then thinking about, well, if the child's experience is one of violence, they might not have been the individual target of that violence, but obviously if your mother is being assaulted in front of you, that's going to impact on your experience of safety. Okay, so to quickly barrel through the results. When we talk about sensitivity to reward and loss, we're talking about how we respond to different contingencies. So two important elements here are conditioned avoidance, how we learn to avoid cues that have been associated with an aversive stimuli, and risk-taking, how we weigh potential for reward against potential for losses. We know that facilitated conditioned avoidance has been associated quite strongly in developmental literature with anxiety. So as such, if we see a pattern of facilitated conditioned avoidance in maltreated participants, perhaps that might give us some clues about the mechanisms that sit under their increased experience of anxiety. In our study, we found weak evidence, note my caution, of facilitated conditioned avoidance for maltreated but not non-maltreated participants, and specifically for those exposed to physical abuse. So again, noting my previous caution, it seems that exposure to physical abuse may contribute to generally facilitated conditioned avoidance, a pattern that has been linked to the emergence of anxiety in development. Risk-taking. We also know that risky behaviour is common in this cohort, right? We deal with this every day in our practice. However, evidence from experimental paradigms is really mixed. On our paradigm, we asked young people to pursue the potential for reward, but there was always the risk of losing it all. So this was a fun task that the kids loved. They had to pump up a balloon on the television, on the computer screen, and the bigger the balloon got, the more points they got. But there was always a chance that the balloon would pop unexpectedly. And so it was really seeing how much risk were they how big were they willing to go with this balloon before they banked the balloon. They knew they had only a limited number of balloons. And so kids, they found it really competitive. They really wanted to get a really high mark. There was a nice bar on the side that sort of added up as they went. They wanted to get as close to the top as they could. But there was always this idea of risk. So on that task, we saw no real difference between maltreated and non-maltreated participants, which certainly surprised us. To look a bit deeper though, we knew from previous research that there are gender differences in risk-taking behaviour. So we looked at the male and female participants separately, and again there was a slight suggestion that maltreated girls may be more risky than their non-maltreated peers, but no difference in the male group. Interestingly, more chronic maltreatment, so this is maltreatment experienced over more developmental periods, was associated with greater risk-taking for maltreated girls. Okay. So we're all familiar with the idea of maltreated children and young people being hypervigilant to threat, yeah? We hear that a lot. However, what's the mechanism that sits behind this bias, given that attention is actually kind of a competition between bottom-up processes of cue salience, how important the cue is, how much it stands out to us, and top-down processes of attention control. We should also note that studies that have tried to look at this threat-related bias have found somewhat mixed results. While most have found hypervigilance, some have reported avoidance, some have reported no result. So we really wanted to dig into this and see what was going on. What we do know about hypervigilance to threat is that it is linked to anxiety. So again, this might be a possible mechanism for the increased anxiety of maltreated children and young people. So we sat the children through a series of tasks. They didn't like these ones so much. That was the very, very clear feedback. And we found some evidence that maltreated participants were hypervigilant to threat. But in particular, our study suggested that this had a particular role of attention control. So maltreated participants showed some difficulty in filtering out task-irrelevant threat-related cues. So one can imagine, for example, how this might impact on children and young people. So being settled in a classroom, for example. If they're unable to filter out such task-irrelevant cues, a look of frustration in a peer might be interpreted as a potential threat to them and stimulate their stress response system. But perhaps attention control could be trained. Perhaps we could develop some attention control games. Everyone loves their tablets. And some tasks in this way could be developed to either strengthen attention control or otherwise adjust attention bias. And there's certainly some emerging work looking at cognitive bias modification that uses techniques like that to help children and young people adjust those. So perhaps there could be some value in exploring those for children and young people that we work with. So interpreting uncertainty. So the attribution, 5 minutes? Okay. The attributions that we make about uncertainty fundamentally shape our experience of our environment. This is particularly the case with our peers. So if we walk over to a group and they're all having a laugh, whether we assume that they're just sharing a joke or laughing at our expense will certainly impact how we feel and how we approach that situation and other situations like that in future. There is evidence that maltreatment might be associated with making more hostile or negative attributions, with one study in particular showing that negative attributions were linked to later peer difficulties. However, in our sample, again, across a range of tasks, we found no evidence that maltreated adolescents differed significantly from their peers in the interpretations that they made. Now, there could be a number of reasons for this. One, our young people were much older, and secondly, they had also, on average, been in relatively stable out-of-home care placements for some time. So it could have been that they maybe had learned to make the benign interpretations through their relationships with their carers and other peers, and so had learned to sort of overcome that. Alternatively, perhaps they were able to present the benign answer in the relatively cold, safe, abstract pen and paper task, but when they're actually engaged in these interactions in the real world, they do make more negative interpretations. And certainly there's some studies from the UK, reports from foster carers that suggest that this might be likely. So understanding others' emotions and perspectives. So I won't go through, obviously, how important it is to recognise emotions and the perspectives of others, and how important this is for our social world. What we found is that there was some weak evidence of maltreated participants showing difficulty interpreting emotion, and also in understanding the internal perspectives of others. So young people in the maltreated group, and particularly, interestingly, this was not associated with the presence or absence of physical abuse. So it seemed to us to be more associated with those co-occurring things, neglect or emotional maltreatment, that really undermine their understanding of emotion and the internal mental states of others. Again, so this might again be a point of intervention. Previous research has suggested that this skill emerges over development, and through coaching, that's sort of geared in our serve and return relationship. So perhaps we could train carers to explicitly coach this in children and young people. And finally, pro-social behaviour. This was another one that the kids loved. How we engage with others is central to our social world, and research tells us that children and young people in out-of-home care struggle. So previous research has suggested, for example, that maltreated children are more likely to be bullied, are more likely to also be bullies, and they tend to enact fewer pro-social interactions with their peers. Our study, we found that maltreated adolescents tended to respond in less pro-social ways in the presence of cues of peer distress. And again, this was associated not with physical abuse so much, but with neglect or emotional maltreatment. We weren't able to pull those apart. And in hindsight, I really wish that I'd followed this study up with an interview study of the kids to really understand how they made their decisions in the game that they were playing, because that would have really shone a light on what was the background and the thinking in that. So something for a future study. So implications for this. This study examined cognitive processes in adolescents, hoping to understand risk for emotional and social difficulties, and perhaps to identify some candidates for intervention. And we found some of those, like attention control or the coaching of perspective taking. But in general, we kind of raise more questions than answers. Still, it extends previous research, particularly particularly bringing the focus to adolescents in out-of-home care. And this research suggests that many of these difficulties actually persist into adolescence. And so if these difficulties persist into adolescence, to me this emphasises the importance of early intervention and family strengthening. I'm sure, talking to the converted here, but we're far better preventing these sorts of concerns than trying to repair them. And so that's certainly a focus of our hopes for this system. And given that this early period is one of calibration and that these cognitive processes do seem to persist, then we'd probably expect them to be strategies that persist on into adulthood, which then probably it talks to some of the challenges that young people that come through care might face when they become parents themselves. These are their strategies to stress, and certainly I don't know of many things more stressful than raising children. Then what supports do we need to offer to children and young people who have come through care when they're becoming parents themselves? So I also wanted to just note some final points. First, I wanted to just reflect on the importance of culture. So while this study has focused largely on implicit cognitive processes, and it sort of reflects a general evolutionary or biological, the way that our stress response system is set up as humans, we have to remember that what we're talking about also fundamentally impacts on the way we experience the world. So in this way, it also interacts with our cultural worldview to determine our lived experience of the world, the meaning that we draw from each of the tiny interactions and applications of these cognitive processes. So while that was beyond the scope of this small study, I think it's really important to keep that in mind. And for Aboriginal children in care, these cognitive processes and how they've developed would interact, shape, and be shaped by experiences, including experiences of systemic and interpersonal racism in the community. So we have to acknowledge that the societal level is really important here, as well as the family and individual level. I also wanted to comment on the importance of practice-informed research, just quickly, and the need for stronger links and better opportunities for practitioners to examine these issues, to improve our understanding and the outcomes of the children that we work with. For me, I think we have an obligation to investigate and gain an ever greater understanding of what's happening for the children and young people that we work with. And I was certainly really honoured and privileged to be able to have that opportunity to take some time away from my psych role and go and do that work. And I think it would be really good if we could look at how we could expand that structurally, because I certainly know that we have many very talented, experienced and knowledgeable practitioners out there who could really make a great contribution in that way. And I think in particular there is a need for that to be more Aboriginal-led and community-based research for our children. And finally, I also wanted to just acknowledge the amazing resilience of the children and young people that I saw. So although on average maltreated children, and we use the SDQ, concerns noted, and on our study, on average, maltreated children were rated as having greater difficulties across all of the domains. But when we actually look at the individual children and the standardised cut-off scores, up to 39% of the maltreated sample could be considered resilient. And that's me using a pretty stringent definition of what resilience is. So that was children that on the Australian standardised cut-offs fell in the normal range. So not the at-risk range, the normal range. 39% of our maltreated sample fell in that range. And for me, this really reminds us of the need to see the individual children behind aggregated statistics and to hold hope for the children that are in our care, fostering their aspirations and supporting them to fulfil their potential. And I think that's the best place to finish.
Thank you so much, Paul. I wish we'd had time to show you some of the actual really innovative programs that Paul used to build some of those games, which are computer games for the children. So much rich information, but also I really want to thank you for the way you always speak with such care about children and young people and your research. So thank you. Far be it from me to be the woman that stands between you all and a cup of tea. So I think 20 minutes, is that still right, Michael?
15.
Yeah, okay.
Sorry.
15.
Jessica's the timekeeper. So we're now at 15, which is plenty of time to get a cup of tea. We'll be setting up the panel. Please be back then. Welcome back, everybody. So now we have the pleasure of a panel session, and hopefully we've got some great questions that people are bursting to ask. So you already have been introduced to three of our panel members, Kathleen, Fiona and Paul, and now I'd like to introduce three more who are probably well known to many of you. Margaret Cashman up the end there. Margaret is the Executive Officer of the Ethics Committee at the Aboriginal Health and Medical Research Council of New South Wales. Margaret has worked with the committee since early 2016, and before that she was employed by Menzies School of Health Research in the Northern Territory. Margaret is incredibly passionate about research ethics, particularly in the context of cultural competency in research. Margaret has an undergraduate degree in biomedical science and has completed the Australian Consortium for In-Country Indonesian Studies Public Health Program in Indonesia. Welcome, Margaret. Next to Margaret, no, that's not true. I was about to say next to Margaret is Mandy, but that's not true. Next to Margaret is Paul. Paul works with me in the Office of Senior Practitioner, and before that I had the pleasure of knowing Paul's work in Bathurst. There's a some formal words about Paul here, but what I can really tell you is that he's an outstanding practitioner, and that is so important in our field, people who can really work alongside families with compassion and intelligence in the way Paul does. Paul's currently working as the Principal Project Officer for the review of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children in out-of-home care, which is a massive and incredibly important job that our department has undertaken under the external leadership of an independent chair from the University of New South Wales. So you'll hear more about that later. Paul is incredibly passionate about his work, and he's always maintained a social welfare focus, seeking to improve outcomes for Aboriginal communities when they engage with the child protection system. And last but not least, I introduce you to Mandy Young. Mandy has asked me not to read the formal bio in front, but what I can tell you is that Mandy is Executive District Director for our Southwestern Sydney District. Recent changes in our structure, Mandy came across from Central Sydney to the Southwest, and she has worked in public service in the fields of housing, child protection, domestic violence and sexual assault victims of crime. The other thing I could tell you is that Mandy is incredibly passionate about all of our work across our department and to breaking disadvantage for our families. So thank you and welcome. All right, so that's our panel introduced. Now it's over to you for some questions. The whole panel doesn't have to answer your questions. You can address a question just to one member of the panel. They've got a mic, they'll be able to work it out themselves. It's always hardest getting the first hand up in these situations.
I have the mic. Can everyone hear me? I have the mic and I can hand it around to anybody who wants it. I have a question to start. Fiona, I understand L6 longitudinal, but I don't think you've mentioned about how long it intends to go on for. Does it have a time frame?
I probably don't need the mic, I'm really good at projecting. We have ongoing funding from federal government, which is fantastic. Though having said that, they're not going to let us keep going if the families don't want to be involved in the study anymore. So I kind of have a rule of thumb that if we drop below about 1,200, then we're in deep trouble, and we won't keep going. And if there aren't data users in policy areas and in government who want to use the data to improve outcomes for kids, that'll stop us from going. But ideally, what we want to see is what's happening for the kids as they move into post-secondary education and training and employment and having kids of their own and look at life course trajectories. And I'm hoping they'll wheel me out, in 20 years' time or something, or 40 years' time, and we can go, yay! And we'll have these enormous people say, I was in the study, as it goes. So, yeah, forever, hopefully.
Thank you. Other question?
Do you have specific ways of continuous actually engaging these families, or is it just from the interviewers turning up at the door?
That's a really good question. We have a whole bunch of different ways of doing things, and different things suit different people. So we send out birthday cards every year, we have a calendar, we have the feedback stuff that goes out at Christmas that says this is what we are finding from the last wave. The interviewers live in the areas where they work. So having said that, the area is really big. So our interviewer in Mount Isa will also go out to Doomadgee and Mornington Island, up to Katherine, and cover a wide range of areas. And then when she needs a change of scenery, go down to Shepparton or South Coast. So mix it up a bit. But in general, she's in the same community. So we see people down the road, down the street sort of thing. Not quite the same in urban, like our Western Sydney person is based at Doonside, I think, but goes all the way out to Campbelltown. So you're not going to bump into people in the street. The kids get birthday cards. We did do a feedback thing that said, like we ask a lot of free text, and I didn't talk about this, and I'm hogging the panel, sorry. But we released that free text data too, where people in their own voices have said to us, we asked a question, for example, about what is it about being Aboriginal that will help your child grow up strong. So you've got 1,600 answers from parents about what that will be, and you can get that data and you can have a look at it. We've got, how do you teach your child how to deal with racism? And those kind of things are really valuable, but we also feed back to the parents and the kids themselves what they said they wanted to be when they grow up. So an astronaut, or we had a lot of people, a lot of kids who wanted to be Ariel from
You were a 4-year-old.
Yeah, well, we were asking the 6-year-old, and it's changed over time. We've got an astronaut, we've got the next Prime Minister, we've got a whole bunch of stuff, and we gave them back to them, and one of the kids this year has said, you should do that again. That was really good. Yeah, so lots of different.
Thank you. Another question?
I've got a question. It's for Dr. Paul. So just from
This is a question for Dr. Paul.
Yeah, Dr.
Suits him.
Just you're a psych within the facts. So where do you see the opportunities to take the research you've done and help improve our practice or enhance it?
Okay. I suppose I should start with the little confession that I'm no longer a psych within facts, unfortunately. So, but I should say, when I first came back from completing the research, I was very, happy to get the opportunity to move into the OSP, and we did a whole bunch of work there trying to support practitioners across the state, developing up our trauma the trauma training package for practitioners, whole range of other training packages about in line with the practice standards and the practice first framework. So I spent about 2 years trying to deliver that through enhancing that work under Kate. But at the moment I'm over at ABSEC, which is the Aboriginal peak in this area. We're doing a whole range of work, mostly in partnership with FACTS, and it's both at the individual programs level, how do we know that the things we're doing with families and with children and with communities is actually making a difference for them in real terms, reducing risk and enhancing outcomes. But also, what are the systemic and other levels that we need to tweak, change, or completely throw out, so that the whole system can work much more efficiently at that idea of better outcomes for our children. So all of that, I suppose, is informed by that initial couple of years as a psychologist out of Campbelltown, supporting a whole range of children and young people at different stages of their out-of-home care journey. And I certainly try to stay as connected to that frontline stuff as possible, because I think it's really important, and Marilyn said the same at the start, it's really important that the people who are doing the system stuff and the policy stuff know what it looks like on the ground, in families, in communities, with practitioners. Otherwise we're just making things up. That's my view.
Maybe I can add
Yeah,
to that.
great. Thanks, Mandy.
Really good point. So I'm Southwest Sydney. We've got more than 2,500 kids in care, and we knock on the doors of 4,000 kids a year. So when I come to research seminars and think about, well, what is it that I can take away from that? There's always a little bit you can take away. the translation from research into practice is always really difficult. So when you're knocking on the door of a family and they're in crisis for some reason, because we don't turn up to families when they're not in crisis, let's be honest. For them to take on the fact that, you know, yes, it's actually your kids should be going to preschool because then they're going to have longer term outcomes. It's very far from where you get when you knock on the door. So you actually have to think, how do you skill up our practitioners to have that in the back of their head but be able to work towards it? And there's a very big gap sometimes between those two. So from each of the research, I could take something away, like from Paul's, I took away the maltreated girls. I think that's our adolescents and our CPAR teams would be really interested in some of that. You know, Fiona, I really took away from your slide around cultural, what's important to people about culture because of our cultural planning. So you can connect the dots. You know, Kathleen, the ED visits for us, something that we can think about actually, can we get some more information from the ED and hospitals around some of that when we don't usually ask. So there's things you can take away, but how do you turn that into something systemic? And I think there is something to be said about how we follow through the policy. So how it gets from research to policy to practice and where that gaps are. And I think there is a gap in how we do that because, and I think Kate and her team often fill some of this gap, but it's not necessarily that strong in how do you actually get practitioners in the picture, because the intervention is what's going to change it. So how do you actually get the child protection practitioners who are working with these families day in and out, who have seen what works and doesn't work, and how do we get some research around what it is that they're doing that can then support what it is that these guys are doing to give us the full picture of where we can go. And I think that's the tricky stuff. Our practitioners are super keen to work and to operate better and to understand things more, but we kind of do it in little bits of silos because at the same time we take away what these guys tell us and we redesign early intervention, which we're in the process of at the moment, right? Really, really important, but we don't have this research necessarily at our fingertips, so there's some work, and I know that, you know, Marilyn and Kate work really hard with us to get that, but there is a distance. So it's actually how do we close that distance is the key question, and I think we are getting better at it. But I think, you know, the research to practice seminars are a good way that we do that. But I think that there is still that distance and there's still some thinking for us because some people aren't big picture thinkers. And we don't want our practitioners necessarily to be. We need them to work with family. We need them to have the resilience, the courage and the ability to walk with a family through whatever it is that they're doing. So it's how do you marry those skill sets? So I think it's hard, but I don't think it's not achievable. It's just about how we make that pipeline happen.
Thank you. Thanks, Mandy. I think that's a really good opportunity to move to the other Paul. Just if you could describe a bit for the audience about the review you're currently working on, because it really fits with what both Paul and the other Paul and Mandy just said. So thanks.
So we're currently preparing a review for the children entered care, Aboriginal children entered care in 2015 and 16, close to 1,200 Aboriginal children. And we've Professor Megan Davis from University of New South Wales as the independent chairperson. We'll be trying to explore their pathway into care. Were there opportunities such as early intervention where we could have intervened differently, other agencies could have intervened differently, and where that agencies have engaged, what was the success rate, what were we doing during that process, and then into care, looking at the Aboriginal placement principles, which exceeds merely the hierarchy of placement. We are looking at the Aboriginal culture, we are looking at connection to country, we are looking at Aboriginal participation, decision making, Aboriginal self-determination. There are many layers to this process that we're trying to unpack, and understand that where are we doing it, where aren't we doing it? We are a big state with many Aboriginal communities within that. Some of them are very strong and diverse, others are unfortunately still very fractured and struggling. So where there's strength, what can we do other sites to mirror that and actually replicate that? And so as we explore that process for the children, understand their journey on an individual level as well, and try and make some improvements where necessary on that platform. And one thing that was taken from this conversation earlier, Kathleen, you joined up opportunities at the health worker stage for contacts. We are advancing that area, particularly around domestic violence. We've enhanced some of our privacy legislation, so I've been speaking to them about those matters. But the opportunity really in that kind of setting for early intervention, identification, before it escalates to ROSH, which by that time the child's experiencing some significant trauma. And the long-term impacts of that are probably already starting to occur, but the opportunity really at the health worker stage to identify and share information and get some buy-in from other parties to help them along that journey would be phenomenal. Is there any other sites where that's occurring as yet, internationally, nationally?
That's an interesting question. I think we definitely have a lot to talk about offline. So, look, the Seeding Success study, the data resource we built as part of that is novel in New South Wales. It's novel in Australia. The only other state that really has a similar sort of resource at the moment is South Australia, and we collaborate with the leader of that, and starting to do some cross-jurisdictional work with partnership with government. In terms of like being able to follow cohorts of kids from birth entering into out-of-home care, I don't know of any other resource currently in Australia other than the two New South Wales, South Australia systems. It'd be really interesting to hear how you're going about the work you're doing with Megan.
I think we're going to be working quite closely.
Yeah, I think it sounds like, I mean, just as background, the Seeding Success study, it came out of a bunch of health workers. You know, we're all epidemiologists, statisticians, clinicians. A lot of it, I mean, I have a clinical background a very long time ago now, but that certainly fueled my passion for working with disadvantaged communities. I've now long been in the field of epidemiology and quantitative work, but in terms of understanding some of how it is on the front line and how this might translate back, that's sort of for me and for a number of others in the group where that passion comes from. So I think, I mean, you were talking about how do you translate this stuff. I think my experience now is a very long conversation. It's relationships are critical, and one of the things that's, I guess, most challenging as a researcher is the fact that there's often the stability with the people we work with in government is not always there. So while we might invest a lot in trying to build that relationship, and certainly with FACSAR we've had this now really amazing growing partnership over the last 3 to 4 years, and that's with a group, so at least it's not as vulnerable to, you know, one person going. But in health, I mean, I've been working in that space for a long time, and an individual can leave and suddenly a whole program of work can just disappear. So yeah, it is a really long conversation. It has to involve frontline workers, it has to involve researchers, it has to involve policy people, and then when you say policy people, that's obviously such a broad umbrella. It's people who have knowledge of the interface with research, like FACSAR, but then it's each part of the policy organisation as well. And from, you know, as a small researcher, I feel like there's such beasts. Each policy agency on its own is so huge and vast, and so many areas where your work could potentially be relevant, but it's hard to navigate at times. But building those strong relationships with a key organisation like FACSAR is so critical, because at least then people like Jess and Michael and Marilyn are constantly putting us in contact with the people who might most want to know the information that's in the data resource. So, you know, even now, just a couple of meetings today, probably there'll be some really great ongoing collaboration from that.
Fantastic. It's great in your job as chair when the panel just asks questions of the panel like that, and better still when you can hear the answers are about really important connections that we need. So thank you. Yes.
My question is to the Aboriginal members of the panel. We know the numbers are still going up and up for Aboriginal kids in out-of-home care. Do you think that we're really going to get better outcomes without significant input and leadership from Aboriginal people themselves?
We have to.
No.
We have to have that input, otherwise, you know, it conflicts with our cultural backgrounds. You know, leaders and people, and whether they are elders or whether they are leaders within whatever context that is for the community and how they fit culturally, are really critical for us achieving change and sustainability. And I think that's very long recognised in terms of self-determination and the principles that sit around that. So that the short answer is, on my end, no.
I don't disagree. Like we're facing 2 centuries of trauma in Aboriginal communities, a bit longer, and in a period of time, you're trying to reverse that, and then expect them to be healthy enough to take leadership and take care of their kids in a way when they're still very fractured and disabled in many ways in taking that care to that level they're hoping for. And so, timeline-wise, yes, we do need to spend time in this area. We need to invest in it, and we need to support the Aboriginal communities that come through and take care of the kids. It is essential. If we look at the many studies from the Loita Institute and others about racism, Aboriginal kids, and its impacts, it's quite relevant that they be supported within their communities, within their people, and understand that context of being raised Aboriginal. What does it mean in Australia? Outside of that kind of dynamic, it can have some ramifications, and the disconnection that flows on from being removed from your country, your culture, and your people, it's phenomenal. The sense of identity, etc. And we saw that chart earlier that Fiona put up of what people are praising as being good about culture, the work we're currently doing in facts about cultural plans, etc. We're trying to mitigate that and trying to come halfway, but in reality, there's stuff that we just can't get to, and it does need Aboriginal community leading that and taking ownership. As a New South Wales government, we need to try and support them as best we can within that process and appreciate that they're coming from a deficit background, not because they're Aboriginal, but because they've been so traumatised. And that's part of the building, and agencies need to appreciate that process. It's not an instant fix.
I think for me, I mean, in a couple of weeks we're going to be marking 20 years of bringing them home, you know. And the key message out of bringing them home, it was one of Aboriginal community self-determination, right? Earlier this year, New South Wales Parliamentary General Committee number 2 released their child protection inquiry, and one of those recommendations was how do we actually enhance the way that self-determination is built into the system. So 20 years later, we still haven't really cracked it, and that is a concern. And I think that's the thing that we need to flip around if we're really going to make a difference on this thing. And that's going to take some courage from everyone, really. But that said, if we're not here for social justice and we don't come here with courage, why are we here? So I think, you know, the simple answer to your question is no, we're not going to. But the positive is we know that that's what needs to be done. And there's no time like the present to just get that done.
I think just probably to add to that, in South West Sydney we've been doing a lot of work on this in the last 6 months particularly, but a real practical example of how it makes a difference to engage the community and to work with the leaders of the community is to help leaders understand what it is you actually want them to lead. So it's great for us to say, you know, we want you to take a stand. Every single Aboriginal person does not want their kids in care. They want their kids safe at home. We want their kids safe at home. But we don't sort of work with them about actually what does that mean and what does that look like. So we've done some significant work, and it's been hours and hours of sitting in room with leaders and elders across the district, because they're different, because Bankstown's different from Liverpool to Campbelltown, very. I can tell you that in a very small space, about what is child protection, how do we assess danger, what does that look like, you know, what does the court system look like, what is out-of-home care, so they can understand what it is we actually want them to lead. And once you kind of get there and you think about the practice change that you make with that to support people to go to those leaders for those conversations, we've had some practice changes just in the last 3 months which have had significant differences. So the number of Aboriginal kids being removed into foster care has dropped significantly in our district, and that's because we're finding more kinship placements, we're connecting into the community and forcing a practice change. But we had to spend a lot of time with leaders around actually what is it we want you to lead and how do we work with you to be able to lead that, because we're often saying, you know, we want Aboriginal people to do this, but we don't say, well, how do we support you to do that in a real genuine way.
Thank you. I actually am just busting to ask Margaret a question. When you hear about all this significant review work and research work and data collection that's going on, could you just give us a bit of an overview of what you understand the ethical issues involved for Aboriginal communities and children?
Well, I think we've seen some really good examples of, ethical things that the AHMRC look at. In Seeding Success, they had a reference group, which I think Kathleen briefly mentioned, but they routinely went back to their reference group for guidance for community input. That's really important. In Footprints in Time, they had Aboriginal people on the ground working with Aboriginal people, and that's another huge thing that we look at. And people are forever asking, how do I know if I need ethics? Or how do I know that I'm going to get my ethics straight away? Because I've got a 3-month time frame and I just need a yes. And, well, first of all, I will never be able to give them that ever. But as well, when you have these kind of things in place, when you do community consultation from the very beginning, a lot of the ethical issues are teased out through consultation, because you're working with people that know their culture, that know how to tell you what cultural principles need to be built into their research. And so by the time you've come to ethics, that's all built into your research. So then you do have a streamlined process and it is smooth, but consultation from the get-go is huge, and we've seen some great examples of it, so that's good.
Can I
Great,
just,
thank you.
Just to, from the research perspective, we went through the AHMRC, and very supportive process from my perspective. That was a long time ago, and exactly right. They certainly encourage have those conversations early, and appreciate that those conversations are going to take a long time. In the same way that we've spoken about how do we translate this in relationships being key, relationships are key to good research as well. And so, we really spent time going out. I mean, I'm a researcher who was researching in my community, which made that a little bit fun. But also, understanding that in a self-determination point of view, yes, I'm an Aboriginal person, yes, I was looking to do research in my community, I don't have the authority to just say, well, that makes me okay. I still had to go and have the conversations with local land councils, with local Aboriginal community controlled organisations, with ABSEC, about, okay, this is what I'm thinking of doing, what do you guys reckon, what are the pros, what are the cons, and it was part of those conversations that led to the community saying, yes, we really want to be involved. That's why our non-maltreated sample matched. But also they sort of said, look, we appreciate from what you're from the conversation that there are real methodological issues. If we want, these issues we really want to explore with Aboriginal kids, but we know from the methodological issues that that's going to be problematic. So we don't want you to look at it. So I didn't, and that was directed from the community, and that's just. Analysis that's just never been run because that's what the community wanted. And I went back to them after I did the research, I presented the research, I explained to them, the ins and outs. We had a very robust conversation about it. And they know that if they want further research in that area, they can, I'm sure that they'll tap me on the shoulder as communities have wanted to do. And we'll start that again. But I'm still out there I still live down there. And we still have those conversations with community members all of the time. So I think,
Yeah. And I think a key point of that is being willing to alter the research at the advice. That's what makes it meaningful. Not saying I rang someone, I had a conversation, it's done, here's my record, give me ethics. Actually really listening to what people are saying and building that in is really important.
Thank you. Let's go to the group for some more questions. Great.
Dale Forbes, TEI. So it's great to hear that, in all three presentations that you guys are really showcasing the value of TAI of early intervention. So my question might be a bit of a tricky one, but as relevant to all three presenters. When we talk about culture and Aboriginality, I'm keen to hear about what challenges that you guys faced in addressing that issue of identity and Aboriginality in your with the clients that you were working with. with health, you know, on admissions, it's a tick a box kind of thing. But we know from, you know, 200 years of colonisation, Aboriginal people, you know, are often apprehensive about ticking a box because what does that mean, and where and what path does that take them? So, did you find any discrepancies in, you know, self-identifying, and what was the classification that you used, if you used one? And the second part is, so then culture. We keep talking about the importance of culture. But I'm keen to hear about, did you find any data about, you know, how does culture actually affect outcomes for Aboriginal people? Does it mitigate or reduce vulnerabilities? Does having a strong culture or, you know, language positively impact on the well-being of children and families, communities?
Great questions, Dale. Thank you. There's a bit of discussion here about who's going to answer them. There's a lot in that.
I mean, from the perspective of my research, as I just explained, it wasn't something that was the relative impact of culture was not something that we explored. And, you know, as I mentioned in the talk, there are reasons to think that the cognitive processes are the way that we shape our interaction with the environment. So obviously the meaning that we draw through that is going to be shaped by culture. So I don't think that the processes would be different, but how they then shape our lived experience of the world would differ, I think. In terms of identifying children, we used a range, so obviously we had the file records. In the community, it was through community relationships and self-identification of parents and children, and through conversation with them. As I say, I met every single of the participants individually. I did all of that myself. So that was that element. On the other point about the role of culture, I mean, I think evidence from studies generally clearly show that culture is a protective factor. The Harvard Center of the Developing Child make that quite clear in all of their research releases. How you actually unpick the different elements and their contributions to that would become interesting. But I think some of that previous research that we looked at that was quite lovely around what are the things people value and will pass on in their culture. I think that's going to tell you some of the hints, right? It's about the social networks that come from, you know, being part of your community. It's about that pride and respect and identity that really strengthen you as a person. Those are the things that I think are going to be the mechanisms by which culture confers resilience.
Yeah, I'm frantically writing down a million answers, sorry. Thank you. So, challenges in addressing identity. Yes, we have had quite a number of difficult, challenging things to deal with. One of our interviewers, as an example, I was asking the child the question about who do you learn about being Aboriginal from? And he started to talk about Aboriginal people in a derogatory way when we understood that he was Aboriginal. He'd been identified by his mum that way. His dad was non-Indigenous and was a racist big dog bastard. Let's, name it and shame it. So the interviewer was confronted with, well, how do I deal with that? And she's looking at mum, who's dealing with that on a daily basis from her partner, and going, okay. And so she had to have that whole conversation about, well, no, I'm not lazy, I work, I do this is not what Aboriginal people. So yes, we've had some really challenging situations. We've had 15% of our primary carers have changed roughly, over the wave. So we might start interviewing mum, but maybe the child is with someone else for care. Maybe it's dad that we're interviewing now. Maybe it's somebody different. But their approach to understanding identity is quite different. Yes, we do have some evidence that strength of identity improves outcomes for kids. There is, on the Australian Council for Educational research website, there's a paper called Strengths that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Kids Bring to School, which Stephanie Armstrong is the lead author on. And in that paper, one of the questions that we'd asked was, is there Aboriginal culture something that is central to who you are, is something you don't feel quite so strongly about, I can't remember the actual category, something you want to know more about, something that's, is not at forefront of your life or whatever. Those people who were saying, yes, my identity is something that's central to who I am, or it's really important, their kids have better social and emotional difficulties. So we do have some evidence that, yeah. There's also a paper from Alfred Mike Dockery out about housing and cultural outcomes at the moment, which came out, I think, last year, but if you can't find it, ask me. And I think from some of the ABS, Australian Bureau of Stats, NATSIS or NATSIS surveys, there is some evidence that speaking your language is associated with better social and emotional wellbeing. So there's stuff out there, and there's brilliant papers from Cheryl Kikatucker in WA about what kids value about identity and stuff, and more coming. There's so much more coming because we've got some really fabulous new measures going into next waves. Yeah, now the kids are a bit older, we can really ask about it. Oh, the other thing I should mention is that some of the kids, when we wanted to ask the question about, well, who do you learn about culture from, the interviewers came back from the pilots and said, a lot of kids don't know what culture, what do you mean by culture? What is culture? It's a daily family lived experience. What's this culture business? So we had to say, who do you learn about being Aboriginal from? Now, you can have a look, then we've got the list of the relationships. Now, most of the kids are learning from mum or dad or aunties or whatever, and there's a smattering who are learning from elders, and you can multiple response it. But there are kids who are not learning about culture from anyone, or they're saying, I'm learning about it from you, my interviewer. This is a tiny proportion. I'm learning about it from my teacher at school. So that connection is, not always there for us.
Great, thank you. Did they answer that for you, Dale?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because there is a lot of research coming this way, and right now we're exploring how do we create cycles of advantage in our communities, and a lot of that is by empowering communities to lead this stuff and take ownership over these initiatives. That's really core to one of the principles of the reform in strengthening communities. So there's this acknowledgement that culture and spirituality are key elements to having enriching communities. It's the application, or the how do we actually make that happen on the ground, from a policy level down to a implementation. And I think it's a very exciting time to be part of that and look at shaping that.
There's so many fabulous Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander, not just on this panel here and in the room, but I work with some really strong people on our steering committee who will slap me and tell me get it right, and it's really encouraging to see that they've got to the stage where they can go, Dan, you get it right, do it this, do it again, do it, and we've got that relationship. And I think, we were saying before, relationships are so important. And as public servants, where I'm encouraged to move on every couple of years or forget your career, baby, it's really hard to continue and maintain. And I've been really lucky that I've been able to stay on this project and work with it. It's a life choice, and it's really, it's been lovely to work on it, as challenging as it is. And people who move on so frequently, it makes it very hard to build those relationships and maintain them. And maybe that's something that people have to keep working on about, well, how do you hand this family on to the next group of people, and how do you make sure that that kid knows that whoever's coming back is someone who really cares about them? And I take my hats off to you for doing that.
So I think, just to add to that, I think it's really important from a practice perspective more broadly, whether that's in designing systems or whether that's in the day-to-day people who go out. That research that's coming through about the strength of culture is extremely important for us to think about how we deal with conscious and unconscious bias, which is sitting around us. There's been such a negative view of Aboriginal people for so long because of the history that we have had, that people need that evidence to show that actually culture is a strength. So whilst it's really annoying, for a kind word to say to it, that we need that research. I think it's really important research for us to get out there to help change people's attitudes.
Fabulous point. Thanks, Mandy. Jessica.
I think some of this has been covered already, but in say 3 or 5 years' time, when all of FACS is delivering culturally competent, evidence-based policy and practice.
3 to 5.
Yes.
Nice.
We won't have moved on because we're off to stay to do it.
What do you think I'm interested sort of from everyone's perspective, the 1 or 2 key challenges or barriers we have to get over to get to that place where we all want to get to? Shall I start with a really quantitative, and then you can move into
Then
the
you
more
can just
interesting,
move down the line.
yeah, working with people stuff that really counts. So from my perspective, what I hope that researchers like myself and the team that I work with can contribute is to be, with the exemplar that we've built, show what whole of government approaches can do when all the data that is currently siloed in different agencies is joined up in a secure and private and safe way that will inform better practice and to help these families get the support they need earlier, for the system to learn what is working and what isn't working by building in the use of these data and appropriate methodologies to evaluate what works and what doesn't at a population level. And I think it's really exciting times. I mean, this sort of study 5 years ago, when we wrote the application, it seemed very pie in the sky, you know, like no one was linking that many data sets. To stand up today and say we've now linked 10 data sets together to follow these kids, it's such a huge advance. And what we've managed to do now is create the infrastructure. This is so amazingly upscalable. So really it's about getting all policymakers on board across government to see what you can show using these sorts of data to help drive system change and monitor the impact of it at that population level. So that's what I hope we can bring to things, and I guess the approach we're seeing is relationships with policy, relationships with community and practitioners, and that if we keep focusing on small, worthwhile pieces of work now, hopefully we can win the hearts of those at the very end of the system to show that this is a no-brainer. Like, we should be creating this learning data system that can feed back. And it's certainly happening in other parts of the world, which can give us inspiration, and we can join that leading pack quite easily if we all get on board and work together. So that's what I hope.
Do you want to There is no end point. There is ongoing learning all the time. And to quote, well, I don't know if it's a quote, but Marcia Langton was at the IATSIS conference, and she really knows how to stick it to people. She said, we've got, you know, everyone's talking about research impact. Well, I'll give you research impact. It doesn't matter what I say or do. If you white fellas don't get it right, then, you know, don't listen to what I say. How can I show impact? So that listening and respect and ongoing learning is something that every agency has to commit to, and every new director and every new executive that I get, we have to keep starting again, and you go, it would be really nice to not have to start from the beginning. And I see the people on our steering committee who are, and people like Pat Anderson, who say, I've been doing this for so long, it's getting really tiring. And I think it's changing to the state where we don't have to keep starting at the beginning, but we can then go, okay, let's build on the base that people know, and that's where you'll be in 3 to 5 years' time, which is great.
I think, 3 to 5 years is optimistic. But I think what I would say is to build on that, and it's about respect, and I think it's respect that Aboriginal people are the experts in their own lives, and we can have all of the research in front of us, but every Aboriginal culture is different, every family is different, every community is different, but we have enough respect to understand that Aboriginal people are the experts in their own lives and balance that with the decisions that we need to make sure that the kids and families are safe. So I think in 3 to 5 years, if people and our practitioners and our systems respected that Aboriginal people know what they're doing, they're invested in what they're doing, and they actually, you know, are good at what they do in terms of their culture and supporting their families and what that looks like. And we respect that they are the experts in their own lives and stop trying to be the experts for them and making it up if we're not, or we think they've got a gap because they don't do something this way or they're not wearing their ochre today, is you know, I think that's the key. It's allowing that to happen.
I was thinking about this, and I was also thinking about Mandy's last comment around the fact that we need evidence to show that somehow our communities deserve their fundamental human rights. And I mean, no one looks at Scandinavia and goes, "You guys are doing a really great job with children and young people. They outstrip us in most measures. Come on, Australia, justify why you get to make decisions about your kids. Why don't we just ship them all off to Scandinavia? They'll do better." But this seems to be the level of thinking that we apply to Aboriginal communities. So I think for me, the barrier that we still face, and I certainly don't think that those are the thoughts of individual peoples, but they're the systemic barriers that I think reflect the worst of colonialism in this country, and the fact that it still persists. And in that way, structurally, it achieves what some of those systems were always intended to do, which is deny our children from their, remove our children from their families. So I think we need to show some courage to address some of those issues and to really decolonise our spaces. And I think, so that means for me, really empowering communities with the tools they need to build the structures, the social institutions that we sort of take for granted as part of the broader Australian community, but that have been destroyed over the last 2 centuries. And for me, I think data plays a huge role in that. I want to see Aboriginal communities given the tools for continuous improvement in their patch. That means having data-driven, having community-led approaches that are informed by iterative access to data, so that we know that this year we're doing, here's our benchmark, and next year we're going to do it better. And the year after that, we're going to know what parts didn't work so well, what parts did work so well, and the community's going to have the tools to enhance those that are working, fix those that aren't working, and we're going to do better again in 2019 and 2020. That's, I think, when we'll know we've cracked it, when communities are just driving their own improvement.
Question. Okay.
Yeah, sorry, just following on from that whole point, it's exactly where my question is going to be at. So, with seeing success of healthy, how local and granular is the data?
How granular?
Yeah, how local is the data?
Yeah. So we have standard units that the ABS use. We can break it down to, mostly we only go down to statistical local area, just because, especially for analyses by Aboriginality, if you want to protect people's privacy, you've got to be quite careful about how small the numbers are. But again, it's something we do in consultation with our reference group, which includes representatives of the AHMRC, representatives of communities and service providers. And so those issues are always at the forefront. We also have Indigenous researchers involved in the project as well. So everyone's keeping an eye on those sorts of issues around privacy. And I guess in that conversation that was just happening, I just wanted to add to the fact that I think it's a responsibility of all research projects like Seeding Success, and this is something that we address in the early stages and in presenting our ethical arguments to the Aboriginal Health and Medical Research Council, is that there's a responsibility to involve community from representatives statewide from the outset and through the entire process, because as Paul's saying, it needs to be owned and driven. We're just trying to provide tools to help local communities drive change, and that involves capacity building at the forefront, as well as Indigenous research capacity. And we're seeing, we try to support early and career mid-career Indigenous researchers, and we have some really senior Indigenous researchers involved as well. And that's just got to be seen as a long-term vision, gradually building up the capacity. And I think there's some really nice examples like LSIC, like the SEARCH study, which is another study of urban Aboriginal children, and that is conducted in Campbelltown as one of the sites in New South Wales, where basically over a decade, the partnership between Aboriginal community controlled services and their leaders and their organisations, they really over time the research team has just gradually supported the data and the use of those data. And that's another study I'm involved in, and it's an incredible thing now to go along to the research meetings. It's almost all local community leaders sitting up there telling their stories about how the data's been used. The stories of the women and their kids that stood up there last year just had us all in tears. And those things are just the really great examples of how this sort of research, when conducted in partnership, can really make a difference.
I think to build on that, given that that work has done, you can really see it from a local level. When we go out and we talk to the community, they want the data.
Oh yeah.
Don't go to them without the data.
Yeah.
So I am constantly annoying CGP and FACSA to say this is where we're at today on whatever it is, and they get used to the data, and it does drive them.
Yeah, it drives change if they own it and can use it themselves. And so we just see ourselves as in the background trying to build that capacity to enable each community to take that data and use it to advocate for what they need for their local kids and families.
I'm just very aware of the time now. Margaret and Paul, just if there's anything you wanted to say in closing, particularly on that question before last, if there was something you were hoping or planning to say.
I think quickly, so 5 years, we have a reform agenda of 3 to 5 years, so who knows where we'll be after this one. But I think following from the LSIC and LSAC kind of differences in stresses in Aboriginal households, impacts on kids, the curiosity I would have is the generic kind of service models we purchase and use, and really do they apply to Aboriginal households in that manner? Are we going to see benefits for Aboriginal kids by using a generic model when we're seeing these different stressors? And the benefit we're getting of this growing evidence base is that, first off, we didn't have that previously. So now we're starting to get this evidence base. So hopefully for the next 3 to 5 years, we're actually going to have a more solid evidence base to help us decide about service models for Aboriginal families. And then flowing from what Paul was saying, Mandy, about decolonising the mindset, but also the bravery and courage to start working more with Aboriginal families and communities. Western Sydney are doing great, South Western Sydney are doing some great work at the moment, being out there speaking to their team. It's investing their resources to start doing the groundwork now and working with them, and you may not see the results for some period of time. And as a government agency, we're going to have to accept that sometimes you're not going to see instant results. This is in a space of instant results. If you're after that in the next quarterly cycle, then realistically we're not going to have that. We're not going to be able to report on that. You're looking at long-term change. You're working with people for a long time, and during the process, sustaining that. We often do jump in and invest. We try, but we change staff, we change programs, we change directions. And we move away from Aboriginal communities after making big, high commitments. And the staff who go in are honestly committed. They mean it. But things change. And then the community's still sitting there, waiting for us to be finished. And then you come with the next change. And so it's when we do make those investments, stick with it. Stay with it. Not little trial sites, but stick with it and really see it through to see the outcomes. And this can be that 5, 10, 20 year cycle.
Thank you. Lucky last.
Dr. Paul articulated it very nicely, but I guess in my mind, if the research is all beautiful and it's culturally appropriate, I guess the number one thing, or the top 2 things are, number one, that it's community led, because nobody gets as involved in research or in any activity that's forced on them or that's encouraged on them than research that they're choosing to direct how it happens. And the second point is that capacity building and succession planning for Indigenous researchers would be built into everything that we would see. Those would be my ideals.
Fantastic, thank you. The most important job of an MC is to finish on time, and I've already failed. So I really need to wind this up. I know I speak on behalf of all of you when I express enormous gratitude to our panel today. Kathleen, Fiona, Mandy, Paul, and Margaret. Give them a round of applause.